right, well, welcome everyone to the honors presentation portion of our morning. I'm Shelley Miller, I'm Director of the Program and Environment. We're here with a great slate of honors thesis students who are presenting a year and a half of their work in the making. And so a really great way to highlight their work and learn more in depth what they do. But I want to turn it over to them because we want to make sure that they have as much time as possible. They'll give a talk for a bit of time, and then there will be at least a little bit of time at the end for Q&A of total presentations time of about 20 minutes. I'd like to present our first speaker, which is Abha Panda, assessing the habitat suitability of wild rice in Michigan. She is advised by her faculty advisors, Bob Pillsbury, with co-advisors Shane Lashawa and Jason Talant.
Awesome, thank you so much. So as for Shelley's introduction, I'll be talking about assessing habitat suitability of wild rice in Michigan lakes and rivers. So what is wild rice and why do we care about it? Wild rice is an annual grass that's been integral to Michigan ecosystems for thousands of years. Before European settlement, dense beds of wild rice were widely found in lakes and rivers across the state, such as the one pictured here, where they were commonly harvested by Anishinaabe tribes for sustenance. Anishinaabe people refer to the plant as manumin, meaning the good berry, and use the seeds in particular. Unfortunately, wild rice has been disappearing due to habitat loss since the 1800s. Here's a map of the historic distribution of wild rice before the 1800s. As you can see, it's statewide. Since the 1800s, however, urban and residential development, agricultural development, and dredging have greatly deteriorated the wetland habitats that wild rice occurs in. As such, populations of wild rice are greatly diminished today. It's actually estimated that only 1% of naturally occurring wild rice stands remain in the state today. There are two species of wild rice that are focal species for restoration in the state: Zizania aquatica, southern wild rice, and Zizania palustris, northern wild rice. There's a couple of physical differences that distinguish the two. Zizania aquatica tends to be taller and have wider blades at maturity. It also tends to be more concentrated in the southern part of the state, whereas Zizania palustris also grows in lakes in the north. The two go through very similar complex life histories, however, that can affect their viability. Both species have seeds that germinate in the spring. They germinate after an extended period of overwintering, though, in freezing or near freezing waters. In years that these specific temperature requirements aren't met and water levels aren't sufficient, the seeds can actually remain dormant for years up to a time, leading to a lot of interannual variation in the presence of wild rice in wetlands. In years that the seeds do germinate, they enter the floating leaf stage, which is when they send their shoots to the surface of the water. But this is actually a really critical period for the plant. It's super vulnerable at this time. Its root systems haven't been completely developed and it's still exposed at the water surface. So uprooting and environmental disturbances can really disturb wild rice beds at this time. Eventually it emerges and reproduces in the fall, but because of the fact that seeds can remain dormant over the years in the critical period of floating leaf stages, there's a lot of interannual variation. So in areas that wild rice occur one year, they might be completely absent the next year and come back the year after. So it operates in these kinds of cycles in wetlands. And many communities depend on wild rice seeds and beds throughout its life cycle. Waterfowl like ducks and geese use wild rice as a staple food. Other wildlife, such as muskrats and water birds, have been noted to depend on wild rice seeds for food and the stalks for shelter throughout the changing seasons. In addition to ecological communities, a lot of human communities continue to utilize wild rice seeds as well. Many Anishinaabe communities continue to cultivate and harvest the few remaining wild rice stands across the state in annual harvest such as the one that's pictured here at the bottom. And this has a lot of economic potential as well. It's estimated in Minnesota that wild rice harvests bring in about $19 million of profit for harvesters. So if there's so many benefits for wild rice, why aren't we planting more of it? So unfortunately, restoration efforts in Michigan have had limited success, although there have been few that have been successful. And one major reason for this is that suitable habitat remains largely unknown. So it's not clear where exactly in Michigan planting rice seeds can have a good effect. There have been a lot of environmental influences that have been noted to affect wild rice growth, however. For instance, wild rice has been noted to grow in a relatively narrow range of water depths. Climatic variables have been noted to have an influence. Wild rice tends to require colder winters and lower levels of precipitation. Additionally, water chemistry and a wide range of biotic factors, such as plant communities that might outcompete the plant or herbivory by local wildlife, can also affect its growth and germination. And anthropogenic disturbance, which reduced wild rice habitat in the first place, continues to have effects. And so it's important to understand how these factors that we know influence wild rice growth relate to environmental conditions throughout the state of Michigan in order to have successful restoration. So a lot of current restoration efforts rely more on historical information on where wild rice has grown, and they can be more localized because of this and not as replicable on a larger scale. There is more knowledge of spatial distribution of wild rice and the environmental factors needed to grow wild rice in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and that has led to restoration success in these states. So there's a lot of potential behind this to understanding where wild rice grows best in Michigan. Luckily, we have tools that can help us. So species distribution models are one of these tools. So what species distribution models do is they take species distribution data, which is pictured here. So that's basically where a species occurs and where it's absent, and it pairs it with environmental predictors that might influence its growth to create a suitability map, or a map showing the probable occurrence of a species throughout a range based on where it occurs and the environmental predictors. And so there are many species distribution models. The one that I used in this study is called maximum entropy, or MaxEnt. It's a machine learning algorithm that's particularly good for species with limited ranges or small sample sizes, such as wild rice. And so what this does is it compares environmental conditions at presence points and background points, which it treats as absences, to generate a predictive model. And so this study used MaxEnt as a tool to identify key environmental variables that influence wild rice occurrence in Michigan, and also predict suitable sites for wild rice restoration throughout the state. And so how is this done? So the first thing that's needed in this model is species distribution data, or data about wild rice occurrence. Unfortunately, there's no statewide survey of wild rice, as there is for many other plant species throughout the state. So the data used in this study was compiled by Barb Barton from a variety of historical and current sources spanning from around the 1900s to 2017. Only extant sites, or sites where wild rice currently occurs, were used, however, because wild rice has this interannual variation that I talked about before, where it can grow in one area one year and not be there again the next year. Extant sites were considered extant if they had had wild rice in them over the last couple of decades, around 20 years. There's also not very much distinction made between the two species, Zizania aquatica and palustris, in the data set, so this wasn't able to be included in the model as well. But overall, 170 occurrences were mapped. So this occurrence data was then paired with key environmental parameters. In addition to the scientific literature, environmental parameters were identified through conversations with the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative Monitoring and Restoration Subcommittee. The Michigan Wild Rice Initiative is a coalition of 12 federally recognized tribes and governmental agencies that are dedicated to conserving wild rice in the state, and they are experts on restoration. And so through these conversations, 32 variables were initially identified. Unfortunately, highly correlated variables can mess with model predictions, so they were removed based on their ecological significance to wild rice growth, and also their contribution to the MaxEnt model. Variables that didn't contribute much or didn't have ecological significance were removed until no highly correlated variables remained. So ultimately, 12 variables were included in the final model. And so this includes things like the presence of wetlands, dams, and muskrats, different things about the habitat, such as the land use and land cover, the plant communities, and then a wide range of bioclimatic variables, including precipitation and temperature ranges. And so this occurrence data and the environmental data was put into the model. So these are maps of just the environmental data. It was mapped together with occurrence data 5 times in the model. So the model is trained using the same data set. Part of the data set is set aside as training data, and the model uses this data set to make predictions and validate those predictions using a second subset of the data. So it's like, how good are its predictions? So the model was run 5 times in order to validate it, to make sure that it was making accurate predictions, and then all these iterations were averaged to create a final prediction. So what did we find from this? So overall, the model was an accurate predictor of wild rice occurrence. So area under the receiving operator curve, or AUC, is a common measure used to evaluate species distribution models, and it basically tells us how well a model can tell apart environmental conditions at presence and absence sites. So an AUC of 1 indicates perfect model fit, it's perfectly able to tell apart the differences, and this model had an AUC of around 0.94, so it was a highly accurate predictor overall. And so the model found that restoration across the historic range of wild rice may be possible. It identified a bunch of different lakes and rivers throughout the state. So here's a map generated by the model. It estimates the relative probability of occurrence. So lighter colors are areas with low probabilities of occurrence, and darker areas are areas with higher probabilities of occurrence. As you can see, even though there are probabilities of occurrence throughout the state, highest probabilities of occurrence tend to be concentrated more in the western parts of the state, as well as the southwest portions. Additionally, there are a lot more localized changes too. You can see here, even in the same lake, certain patches are identified as more suitable to wild rice growth than others. And so the question is, what kind of drives these localized changes? So the model found that wetland presence was the single most important predictor. Here is a table of each variable and the percent that they contributed to the model fit. So from here, you can see that wetland presence contributed almost 40% to model predictions. Interestingly, wetland presence was restricted to undisturbed wetlands only. There were low predictions of occurrence in areas with anthropogenic disturbances, such as urban and residential development or dams. So here we have a chart of wild rice prediction based on dams. Here's the absence of dams, here's the presence of dams, and then on the y-axis is the probability of occurrence. Higher probabilities of occurrence tend to be 1, 0 indicating no probability of occurrence. So from here we can see that wild rice is predicted by the absence of dams more, and red is used to indicate the averages in this graph. And so vegetative cover was another factor that was identified as really important for restoration and informed a lot of these differences in localized changes. So here again, we have another response curve graph with the 24 categories of plant communities that were inputted into the model and the relative probabilities of occurrence predicted by each. As you can see, certain plant communities had higher probabilities of occurrence, predicted higher probabilities of occurrence than other plant communities. And so these ones were a lot of vascular plants such as coontail, pondweed, water lilies, and milfoil. Additionally, specific species like typha and phragmites were identified. Overall, plant communities were found to contribute the most unique information. So this is a jackknife test that runs the model using only one variable at a time. And so the dark blue bars here indicate how much each variable is contributing to the model fit when just that variable is used. From this graph, you can see that plant communities had the highest contribution to model fit when they were used just alone. So they contribute the most unique information, which is really interesting because there's so many plant communities. And this kind of attests to the fact that more information is probably needed on these plant communities to gain a better understanding of their influence on wild rice growth. In particular, typha and phragmites, which were identified as associated with wild rice growth, have both native and invasive variants. And so this model didn't make a distinction, for instance, and so more distinctions on invasive species and native species might be really crucial, and a whole wide range of other plant species need to be included as well for better understanding. In addition to these biotic factors, a whole range of climatic factors were also identified as important. Lower precipitation in general increased viability, and wild rice predictions showed an aversion to extreme precipitation in particular. So this is a response curve showing precipitation in the wettest quarter. You can see the probability of occurrence really drops as the amount of extreme precipitation increases. But interestingly, May precipitation, out of all these precipitations, was designated as most important. We have this variable contribution chart here again that highlights the 4 precipitation variables that were tested: May precipitation, annual precipitation, precipitation of wettest quarter, and precipitation seasonality. And May precipitation contributed much more than the rest. And so one particular reason for this might be because the floating leaf stage of the plant. As mentioned before, it's a really critical period for the plant as it's vulnerable to uprooting and environmental disturbance at this time. And this typically occurs in May in the state of Michigan. Temperatures were another climatic variable that were identified as very important to wild rice restoration. In particular, wild rice showed that it preferred cold annual temperatures. There's a large drop off again in probability of occurrence after around 9 degrees Celsius. This is largely probably due to the overwintering of seeds. Seeds require minimum temperatures in order to germinate. However, interestingly, too cold temperatures were also not seen to be beneficial to the seeds. temperatures that drop below 15 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, were found to have a negative influence on wild rice viability. And so this is really interesting to consider in terms of climate change. If wild rice is really sensitive to colder temperatures in these ranges, then as temperatures warm or shift, the viability of wild rice across the state might shift as well. And so overall, there are 12 variables considered in this model, but the inclusion of additional data can definitely help refine model predictions. So only publicly available statewide data was used. But as discussed, there's a whole suite of variables that were considered as important for wild rice viability, including water depth, water chemistry, recreational access, and invasive species. There's also no distinction made between Zizania aquatica and palustris in this study, although there have been habitat differences noted between the two species. And as the genetic diversity of both continues to diminish along with wild rice stands, it might be important to concentrate efforts for each species respectively or more regionally. And so overall, the study shows that statewide restoration of wild rice is possible, but there are a lot of localized changes that need to be accounted for. In particular, the study identified biotic and climatic factors as important to consider. But there's a whole other suite that can be included as well. It's also important to note that this map is just a relative probability of occurrence, and field testing and actually going out and trying to plant seeds in these areas or seeing if wild rice is growing there can really help refine the predictions and make it usable for restoration. And overall, this also shows that MaxNet and other species distribution models are really useful tools for wild rice restoration. Climate models may be particularly useful given wild rice's sensitivity to different climatic variables. And species distribution models and understanding the spatial distribution of wild rice and these environmental parameters in Michigan may be really important and useful in restoring this valuable species to the state. Thank you so much.
Very nice job. And very, very clearly presented, I'll have to say. We have time for a couple questions.
Hi, this is Amanda Bosak, and I am with the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative. I work for the state of Michigan in our Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Firstly, I want to thank Abha for this work and research and her collaboration with our group. And secondly, I guess I have a question on what would be your future recommendations for continuation of your work on this model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you to the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative for all your collaboration as well and guidance. I guess I think a good next step would definitely be to include some of these other variables that didn't have publicly available data sets, such as recreational access, such as water depth and water chemistry, as these were definitely identified as super important, but weren't able to be included this time. Additionally, I think field testing, as I mentioned, in terms of actually going out and trying to plant the seeds and seeing if they do operate in the way that the model predicts could help refine the model. Like if there are areas that it clearly doesn't predict sites, we could include that in the model as absence locations, and that could further help refine the model over time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Jason, go ahead.
So I'm going to ask you a question that is probably a little outside the scope of what you did. So be patient with me. So one of the things that you mentioned was that the restoration efforts that are happening in Minnesota and Wisconsin seem to be just a lot further along. And that's a little bit curious to me, right? Because I would imagine that some of the environmental variables that you looked at are pretty similar, right, across a lot of the upper Midwest. So I just wonder if you have a sense based on the work that you did, the research that you did, like why we see this difference, right, between restoration efforts in Michigan and why they're not as far along as in some of these other states.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it has to do with, so it's very reliant, has like a long history with human communities in general and its restoration and growth. So I think there's just a lot more communities that are invested in working on wild rice growth in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And additionally, because wild rice stands have diminished so much in Michigan in comparison to those states over time, which have more undisturbed wild rice beds, there's been like less awareness and efforts put into it overall.
So Abha, I understand you'll be working at U of M as a research communications assistant next year, and then applying for graduate school in the next year. What type of grad school are you looking for?
Still deciding, but I'm really excited about this kind of intersection between environmental things and human communities and wetlands. All exciting things to consider.
Well, if your honors work is any indication, you have a very bright future ahead in it. So very nice job presenting, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And now we'll be moving